In this back cover book report, I'll be highlighting philosopher theologian Joseph A. Bracken, author of The Divine Matrix: Creativity as Link Between East and West. Joseph A. Bracken, born March 22nd, 1930, lived through till April 13th, 2024, and died at the age of 93. He was an American philosopher and largely a Catholic theologian, not to mention a very prolific process philosopher. Bracken was a proponent of process philosophy and process theology of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne, which makes much of his work really quite admirable. A lot of his work is devoted to a synthesis of revealed religion, or religions, as he made an effort to study across cultures and spiritual traditions. Which makes much of his work stand out. He was largely a Christian Trinitarian, and he synthesized the Christian doctrines with a revised process theology. Bracken introduced a field theoretic approach to process metaphysics. He also wrote The One in the Many, a contemporary reconstruction of the God-world relationship, which is another book of his that I have read, extremely enlightening, especially because of his expertise in process theology. He also wrote Does God Roll Dice? Divine Providence for a World in the Making. And that's another book that I'll more than likely pick up, as I admire much of his work thus far. Another interesting work of his is entitled World Without End: Christian Eschatology from a Process Perspective. Another work that I'll more than likely check out. Also, Trinity in Process, a relational theology of God from a Trinitarian perspective. Also, Christianity and Process Thought. What are they saying about the Trinity? And much more. Much more. But in today's highlighted book, The Divine Matrix: Creativity as Link Between East and West, is really quite compelling. And I actually had to read this one quite slow because of all the technical terms that he's familiar with. I had to also familiarize myself with. Dialogue among religions has always been challenging. Today, the questions are becoming more fundamental. Are the various traditions, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, the Tao, even talking about the same thing when they speak of nature or God, emptiness, or Brahman? The Divine Matrix represents a bold scholarly attempt to provide a framework for discussing these and other questions that will keep the interreligious dialogue project from grinding to a halt. I would add that it makes it quite exciting. In The Divine Matrix, philosopher and theologian Joseph Bracken first locates the infinite as transcendent source and goal of human activity as the notion common to virtually all the major world religions. He suggests that the infinite is prototypically experienced not as an entity, but as an ongoing activity, divinity in motion, if you will. The principle of activity for all beings, God included. This idea is consistent with the notion of eternal and continuous motion in Aristotle, which he speaks at length, with the act of being, actus essendi, in the theology of Thomas Aquinas and Meister Eckhart, and with the ground of being of Schelling and Heidegger. He presents a synthesis as well as with Whitehead's definition of creativity. The Divine Matrix proposes that the infinite, thus identified, be understood as a non-dual reality, an activity that does not exist in itself, and I suppose this would include God as well, which is a parting from classical theism, but only in the entities which it thereby empowers to exist. So an example of this would be yin and yang. Neither could exist without the other, and yet the two are harmoniously one or non-dual. This, Bracken argues, becomes the key to understanding ultimate reality within the different world religions. Comments and reviews from the back cover. Quote, an outstanding contribution to philosophical theology. From the foreword by Robert Cummings Neville. Original, insightful, a major contribution. John Cobb Jr. A masterful work, opening pathways for conversation between philosophical and religious traditions of East and West, as well as enriching Christian understanding of the ultimate reality as Trinitarian. Bracken is one of the major contributors to comparative theology from a process perspective. James Fredericks, Loyola Marymount University, Bracken manages a synthetic survey of the Aristotelian, Thomistic philosophical theology with the later contributions of Meister Eckhart, who was a Christian mystic, Schelling and Heidegger philosophers, to the act of being, revamping it through a process mode of Whiteheadian creativity, recommended for its cogent attempt to bring agreement to long-standing discourse. The Reader's Review. In this erudite and thoughtful book in comparative theology, Bracken develops and applies Whitehead's notion of creativity as ontological activity to related themes in Western thought. What strikes me about this book is the fact that the author practices what he preaches. The reader is likely to encounter dialogue which is molded conscientiously and sought in earnest. The general intent of the book speaks to anyone who is interested in dialogue, interreligious or otherwise. Joseph A. Bracken draws on Neville's work in thinking comparative problems With the help of process theology, he develops his understanding of comparative issues by drawing on Whitehead's understanding of creativity and the idea of the extensive continuum. Joseph Bracken was active in the Metaphysical Society of America, Catholic Theology Society, and the College of Theology Society. He has written several books on the connection between process theology and Trinitarian theology. And this particular edition, The Divine Matrix, Creativity as Link Between East and West. It's highly recommended for your ongoing comparative studies. And now I'm going to read a section from the back and conclusion of the book, The Divine Matrix, just to give you an idea as to the content of this material. Some of these words are quite unpronounceable, so bear with me as I attempt to pronounce some of the words as I read. I think as long as you get the gist of what's being read, names and mispronunciations mean very little. Quote, in trying to describe the interpenetration of reality and appearance in creativity and Taoism, Chong Chong Yon recalls a celebrated parable which Faust Tang, the founder of the Haiyan school of Chinese Buddhism, delivered to the emperor and the royal court on the occasion, pointing to the statue of a golden lion in the vicinity. Fa Zhang commented, gold symbolizes reality and the lion symbolizes appearance. Reality is formless by itself, but assumes any form that circumstances give it. Similarly, gold has no nature of its own, but is shaped into the form of a lion as its appearance. On the other hand, the lion is merely a form or an appearance, which has no reality of its own. It is entirely gold. When one is impressed by the quality of gold thus represented, the figure of the lion fades into its significance. On the other hand, when one's eye is drawn to the artistry of the sculpture, the fact that it is made of pure gold is for the moment forgotten. Ideally, one should advert to both the form and the precious metal at the same time and appreciate the harmony between appearance and reality. At that moment, he says, one will experience inner peace in sensing the interpenetration of reality and appearance. In similar fashion, the intent of this book, The Divine Matrix, has been to bring into focus the dialectical relationship between the infinite and the finite within various metaphysical schemes and/or religious worldviews, both East and West. Although this book is short, it is extremely comprehensive, so put on your thinking caps if you're going to read it. For serious students only. The infinite certainly corresponds to reality in the parable of Fa Zhang, since, by definition, the infinite encompasses all that is real, both past, present, and future. Likewise, in itself, the infinite, like reality in the parable, is formless. For by assuming a form, the infinite paradoxically becomes finite or determinate. On the other hand, the finite certainly corresponds to what Fatang meant by appearance. For like the figure of the lion, the infinite really exists, yet its deeper reality is to be the temporary manifestation of something else which never exists by itself, but always comes to expression in and through a quasi-infinite number of forms or appearances, like seeing the gold in the figure of the lion at the same time. Therefore, the deeper perception of reality is to recognize the presence of the infinite in the finite, and thus to acknowledge the provisional, or in any case limited, character of the finite. One cannot, to be sure, see the infinite in the finite entity in the same way that one actually sees the gold in the statue of the lion. Hence, it is much more difficult to remain sensitive to the presence of the infinite in the finite. But once one has truly felt the presence, on one occasion, the experience tends to repeat itself. One has become enlightened with respect to the true nature of reality, and the world is never quite the same again. Even more importantly, however, the purpose of this book has been to determine the nature of the infinite, that is, thus revealed in all the finite persons and things of this world. This would include the religions. My argument has been that the infinite, as such, cannot be an entity, but must be an activity. For if the infinite is an entity, then logically nothing else exists except as an accidental modification of the one, all-comprehensive substantial reality. As Aristotle notes On Generation and Corruption, the component parts of a compound substance are governed by the substantial form proper to the totality. Hence, they are separate substances only potentially, not actually. Thus, if finite entities exist within God or some other transcendent entity, then those same finite entities do not really exist in themselves with their own substantial form, but exist instead only as parts of the all-comprehensive divine being with its substantial form. One might counter-argue here that this line of thought represents a purely quantitative or spatial understanding of the infinite. The infinite, however, is to be understood as qualitative rather than merely quantitative term. An infinite being is that which both contains and transcends all the perfections to be found in finite beings. As already noted in Chapter 2, Christian thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas did indeed revise the classical Greek understanding of the infinite as the void, or the totally indeterminate, in favor of a new notion of the infinite as that which is fully determinate in itself, but incomprehensible to the human mind, because qualitatively superior to anything finite. Thus, God as infinite being is fully actual with no potentiality or indeterminacy, and yet absolutely transcendent of anything finite. Yet, as also noted, while the divine being as the pure act of existence may objectively encompass the perfections of all finite entities, God is the subject of the divine act of existence, cannot subjectively exercise creaturely perfections, in the same way that the creatures themselves do. God, in other words, cannot be both the subject of the divine act of existence and the subject of the act of existence proper to a creature at the same time without contradiction. God cannot, for example, be simultaneously both the I and the thou of the divine-human relationship without destroying the ontological reality of the human thou. The human being, then, in his or her subjectivity, stands outside of God as the divine subjectivity and thereby limits God, equivocally renders God finite. Even though the divine subjectivity is infinitely superior to the creaturely subjectivity, put in other terms, God may objectively understand what it means to be human better than any human being that ever lived. But God cannot, in virtue of one and the same subjectivity, be both a divine and human subject of existence at the same time. Two subjectivities are needed, the one divine and the other human, for a genuine I-thou relation between the divine and the human to take place. But the net effect of this exchange is to render the divine finite in the face of the finite other, the human being in his or her subjectivity. The subjectivity of God is limited by the subjectivity of the human being and vice versa. As noted in Chapter 6, Kaitaro Nishida analyzed this self-contradictory relationship between God and the human being in his essay, The Logic of the Place of Nothingness and the Religious Worldview. This is, God must cease to be the absolute in the context, the infinite, in order to allow the creature to be itself as an ontologically independent reality. Yet, God is at the same time truly God, the Lord of creation, only when creatures exist in ontological dependence on the divine being. Thus, God both is and is not the absolute in relation to creatures. Similarly, the creature first achieves true self-identity when it acknowledges the ontological ground of its being in God. It receives, in other words, from God the power to exist in independence of God as well as in interdependence with God. But even when it chooses to exist in independence of God, it can make that choice only because of God's antecedent self-negation as the absolute or the infinite in allowing it to exist in the first place. The truly infinite within this dialogical situation then is neither God nor the human being as separate entities, but the world as a transformational matrix in which God and human beings encounter one another and by their exchange give new shape and order to the world itself. Yet, as I also argued, what is this transformational matrix if not the divine nature, which is the ontological source or common ground both for the existence of God as a personal being and for all creatures? Out of the absolute nothingness of the divine nature, therefore, both God as a personal being and all finite beings emerge and are dialectically related to one another as a transformational matrix. However, absolute nothingness is not simply a field or spatial context for the interaction of God and creatures. Rather, it is in the first place an underlying activity which empowers God to be God creatures to be themselves, and God and creatures to be dynamically interrelated within the world. Thus, the infinite once again turns out, on closer examination, to be not an entity, not even God as the divine entity, but as an activity in which the existence both of God and all creatures is grounded. And that's a quote from the conclusion of the book. So Joseph Bracken was obviously a comprehensive thinker, and he had the ability to think across traditions quite effectively. And he was undoubtedly a process philosopher. So, yeah, the divine matrix, creativity as link between East and West as we go further in our studies, our comparative studies. So the back cover book report recommends the divine matrix, creativity is linked between East and West. Joseph A. Bracken, philosopher, theologian. Thank you for listening.